So let me introduce Cornelia Scholz from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre, and she's going to present on climate and conflict in Sudan.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Great to be here today. And I'm going to present you my project on compound risk analysis, climate and conflict in Sudan. And maybe to start with, what created the need for this project was the wish to extend anticipatory action to new settings and specifically to conflict settings. And something that was realized in a number of countries, especially in Sudan, is the data scarcity, which makes it really difficult to plan ahead and especially to plan early actions. So what I've started looking into is how to identify high-risk areas in Sudan, and then particularly for this project, prioritize them for crowdsourced mapping and create geospatial data and especially mapping data, which then in the next step can be used in the planning of early actions and really enable to expand to new settings, which so far have been hampered to expand to due to this data lag. And to start with, I want to give you a quick introduction of the analytical concept behind it, which was conducted in GIS. And the idea was to analyze different layers. First of all, natural hazards, where flood extent as well as drought went into. For second layer, I looked into historic conflict data over the last 20 years. For third one, into different indicators of vulnerability, which for Sudan were on one hand food insecurity, but also the location of IDP and refugee camps. And the idea behind it was to identify where all of these different indicators and layers add up geographically. And those areas where all of this applies are considered as high-risk areas and get prioritized for mapping. So the last step was then to identify those high-risk areas, whether or not they are already mapped in OpenStreetMap. And for most areas of Sudan, it turned out that they were at least insufficiently mapped and really, qualified for priority areas. And maybe to mention here the weighted, so it was conducted as a weighted overlay, taking consideration what was of most interest, and for this project, especially IDP and refugee camps, which are at high risk of being flooded, were the major focus, which is why within the analysis, those two layers were the ones which received the most weight. And to show you the layers that went into the analysis, one of them was raster data for flood exposure. Just to mention, all of the data used were open source and open access data sets. Here using the flood exposure for Sudan, seeing especially around the Nile, but also around the south. For second one, drought exposure, again, especially in the south of Sudan. For next layer, I went into the vulnerability layer for food insecurity, where two different data sets were used. One was of the most recent food insecurity of October 2020. And the second indicator that went into it was indication of long-term food insecurity and malnutrition. Here's the data set for the location of IDP and refugee camps, which originally came as location points, and which is why I use buffer zones around them to get a feeling of really the spatial extent of those areas and where a high number of IDPs or refugees is expected to be present within geographic areas. For the conflict analysis, I used the ACLED data set between 2000 and 2021 with all types of conflict included. And in the next step, I ran a density analysis to really identify across the last 20 years in Sudan where those hotspots have been focused most intensely. And to mention the idea behind this conflict analysis was really to see where were the most long-term impacts, with the assumption behind it that those, like that really conflict exacerbates already existing vulnerabilities and those effects reaching until today. So as I mentioned before, for the concept, I used all these layers. I overlaid them to identify those very high risk areas. And here I want to give you an indication of the results. What you can see at this map here, all the areas marked in red are those where really all the layers overlaid on the very high risk level. Just to mention, I reclassified all the data sets to 5 different classes ranging from minimal to very high risk. And here the red ones are the priority areas of very high risk. An idea of the location of IDP and refugee camps. So here the IDP camps are marked in orange, while the refugee camps are marked in blue. Again, those locations, and especially those exposed to flooding, were the main focus within the analysis. So it was specifically interesting where are refugee or IDP camps located around the red areas. So having already very vulnerable populations, but then also been exposed to the risk of drought, flood, historic conflict, as well as different vulnerability indicators. Just to give some insight into the some further data analysis on more the administrative level, we looked into the administrative boundaries of Sudan to identify which are actually the counties and districts which contain priority areas. As you can see here, those marked in red, dark red, are the very high risk priority areas, and the districts in red marked as those containing them. And then really just summing up the data behind it to identify the proportion of high risk areas per county, as well as of the population of high risk areas, to provide a basis for decision making. In the next step, I took this map of the results and priority areas and had a chance to discuss it with an ICRC officer in Khartoum to really get some more insights on verifying the results, but also on looking more into the future ahead and the situation in Sudan. And with that discussion, there really came out 5 areas which are priorities right now. And the first one is right now in the process of creating the first tasks to actually have them mapped out in Sudan, in OpenStreetMap. And I'm gonna walk you through the 5 areas to give you an idea what those priority areas really look like and what the context around them is. So the first one, and the one that is right now prepared for mapping, is the Kassala area. Second one is North Khartoum. The third one is the Nyala area, and they're the Wild Nile River banks. And then looking more into detail, Kassala area, which again is our first priority area. To remind you, the red tiles really showing that all of the different vulnerability and exposure layers overlaid here on a very high risk level. Here you can see the flood exposure map around Kassala, but also around the Reef refugee camp located just in the south. Again, just seeing here, also in the past, records of Kassala and the area being flooded, affecting a high number of people. The idea of what the area looks like, the river going through, really being able to see how it's narrowed down between the urban area and then a very densely populated city of Kassala. And at the same time, in the south, the Reef refugee camp, which is specifically of interest right now because it expected a high number of new refugees coming in, especially from the conflicts around Ethiopia. And what we're interested here is whether or not those settlements are going to expand more into the flood areas, potentially increasing the number of people at risk. So this is actually areas which are right now prepared for OpenStreetMap mapping, and especially seeing whether or not there are new settlements and informal settlements being set up more into the floodplains. For second priority area, it's looking into North Khartoum. Again, the red tiles marking them as very high risk areas. As you can see, highly densely populated and very prone to flooding. Again, this is what it looks like. And then for the third priority area, looking into Nyala in the west of Sudan, again affected by conflict, flood, drought, different vulnerability indicators, and specifically can see here is a number of refugee and IDP between riverbanks. To give an idea what it looks like, there has been a lot of informal settlements settling along these riverbanks all the way here. And then for the Wild Nile riverbanks, south of Kusti and north of the border to South Sudan, again a high number of in this case, refugee camps located right along the riverbanks of the river and within flood areas. And again, what it looks like, and the informal settlements, especially settling along those riverbanks. And as a last one, the Ganaya area, which originally has not come out as priority area in the data analysis, but really came out as a point of future interest in the conversation with country context, because currently conflict is ongoing around the area and is expected to affect a high number of people, which is why I took it in as marked area, a special priority area to further look into. And again, to give an idea what it looks like around the Naya area. And with this, I'm going to finish my presentation. I'm going to share the link for the story map in the chat in just a moment. And if anyone has any questions or wants to know anything further, I'm really happy to answer them. I think I'm pretty good on time, so let me know. Thanks.
Yep,